Hello everyone and welcome to week 3 of our class. Today we're going to talk about two important theories of conflict resolution, which are basic human needs theory and frustration aggression theory. So let's first go into John Burton's basic human needs theory. This theory was initially developed by Abraham Maslow, but it was adopted and applied to conflict resolution field by John Burton. So according to Burton, basic human needs can be frustrated due to certain conditions, such as scarcity of valued goods, both material and non-material, or the unequal distribution of resources. They could also be frustrated due to some attitudes. So people's engagements in conflict stem from series of deep-rooted and deep-seated needs and cognitive imperatives. It is important to mention that needs are not fixed, but they are based on historical, social, and cultural norms. So let's have a look at this pyramid of needs. You will see that there is a hierarchy of needs, which means that there are some needs that are basic, such as physiological needs. These kinds of needs can be food, water, breathing, and so on. And then we have these higher level needs such as safety, belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization, and self-transcendence. So Burton, as we said, did not create this theory, but he applied it to our field and to real-life conflict. He argued that there are certain human needs that need to be fulfilled for humans to live in a peaceful society. So if these needs were to be deprived, people would use violence to satisfy and insist on these needs. Burton points out that important needs are identity, particularly important needs are identity, recognition, security, and personal development. And they can be major sources of conflict if frustrated. So there are many examples of conflicts which are based on issues related to identity, security, recognition, self-development, such as, for example, religious and ethnic conflicts. So basic human needs theory is also connected to structural violence. Structural violence, as we know, was a concept introduced by Johann Galtung. And basic human needs claims that structural violence leads to frustration of basic human needs. So structural violence, as we know, is a form of violence when some social structure or social institution may harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic human needs. What can that be? What kind of examples do we have of this? Well, for example, institutionalized gender inequities, ageism, classicism, elitism, ethnocentrism, nationalism, racism, sexism. So these are all examples of structural violence that lead to the frustration of basic human needs. So needs theory puts emphasis on the distinction between negotiable interest and non-negotiable needs in conflict. So there is this difference between interests and needs, right? So what is that? Needs are assumed to be inherent in all human beings. They are universal. So no matter where you are, you have certain human needs. All people in the world have the need, physiological needs for food, needs for shelter, needs for freedom of movement. So these are some very, very basic needs. Also, security and recognition is the need of all humans, despite, regardless of their cultural and social background. Um, Identity, belonging, security needs are sometimes more important to humans than these physiological needs and even life. So that's why you have, people who really are willing to fight if their parts of their identity is in some way frustrated, right? So conflicts that are rooted in identity are very difficult to resolve, because identity, aspects of identity, aspects of belonging, these are non-negotiable aspects of human beings. So when they are non-negotiable, it's very difficult to talk about them, to try to address them. Basic human needs has led to the development of practice called problem-solving workshops. So the idea behind problem-solving workshops is that conflict may not be about territory or similar grievances, but about underlying needs for security, recognition, participation, and identity. Third-party facilitator in these problem-solving workshops enables what is called controlled communication. So third party brings the conflicting parties together to the table to communicate and define the key problems and issues, as well as their underlying motivations. Controlled communication leads to dealing with conflict constructively. What does that mean? That means that we deal with conflict through dialogue and open conversation. Controlled communication is also used to uncover some true issues, underlying issues and needs of the parties. And what's especially important is that third party is not using coercion, is not using carrots and sticks kind of strategies, but problem-solving workshops aim at win-win solutions and outcomes. What does that mean? Win-win solution is when both parties can gain something from the talks, right? So it's based on this of free will of parties to accept certain concessions. When can parties reach agreement? So parties can attempt to resolve their conflict only when they are ready to do so. So, for example, when alternative, usually unilateral means of achieving a satisfactory result are blocked, and the parties feel that they are in an uncomfortable and even costly situation. So at that moment, which can be called a ripe moment, they grab on the proposals that usually have been in the air for a long time, but only at a certain time, at a certain moment, they appear attractive. So that means that this happens when conflicts are prolonged, and then they start to hurt the parties and lead to the exhaustion of resources. This situation, when conflict starts hurting the parties, is called mutually hurting stalemate. And that's a concept, again, that was developed by Zartman. And when both parties realize that conflict is hurting them, we can say that conflict has reached ripeness. And at that moment, parties are ready to talk. So timing is quite important in conflict resolution. So here we have a representation of conflict. This is a conflict curve, which is how we represent stages of conflict. It's an ideal model, of course. So as you can see, we have in the beginning a latent conflict. Latent means hidden. So there are certain conditions for conflict, but conflict is not visible yet. And then we have conflict emergence. So first instances of violence are happening, and then we have escalation. We have expansion of conflict, and then and that leads to violence usually. And then when parties are hurting and they don't see anymore the point in continuing this violence, we have a stalemate. And then this is the peak of the curve, and then the parties are ready to talk. And of course, that should lead to some kind of agreement, which then leads to de escalation, settlement, and post conflict peace building. So, stalemate is at the peak of the curve, and it denotes a moment when parties are ready to talk because conflict is hurting them both. This is, however, as I said, an ideal model that simplifies the complexity of conflict for the purposes of initial analysis and basic understanding. But we should be aware that in the real world, conflicts can take different twists and turns, and there can be multiple curves. So there can be reemergence of conflict, and there would be multiple curves, not as linear as this model shows. And another theory that we are going to mention in today's lecture is frustration aggression theory. So this theory also looks into a deep internal processes in humans that lead to conflict. So what does it say, this theory? Well, aggression is basically the result of some kind of blocking or frustrating a person's efforts to attain a certain goal. So this theory looks very simple, right? But there are some nuances here, of course, that we'll discuss a bit later. So this theory was proposed by a group of authors, but we usually mention Dollard and Miller and then just put et al. Dollard, Miller, et al. So Dollard, Miller, Doob, Morver, and Sears were first proposed. They were the ones who first proposed this theory, but it was further developed by Miller and Berkowitz later in the 60s of the previous century. And basically, the theory says that frustration causes aggression, but when the source of frustration cannot be challenged, the aggression gets displaced onto an innocent target. And that innocent target is scapegoat. They call it scapegoat. So what does that mean? So, for example, say at a personal and interpersonal level, if, for example, a man is disrespected and humiliated at work, but he cannot direct his frustration to his boss because of fear of losing his job, he may go home and take this anger and pain and frustration, he may take it out on his family. Also, so it explains this kind of behavior, violence, and so on. Also, it can be used to explain riots and revolution, as well as violence directed at minorities. So when aggression cannot be directed against the sources that are causing pain and suffering and frustration to somebody, to an individual or to a group, then people are looking for a scapegoat, somebody else to blame, And so this is a very interesting explanation of some internal psychological processes in human beings and groups that lead to violence. So, in this lecture, we have covered two important theories of conflict resolution, which are basic human needs theory and frustration aggression theory. These theories will help us understand and analyze conflict and different cases of conflict. But remember, not all theories work on all cases. Some theories are applicable on one case, while the others explain other cases. So the main point is that theories are our tools to understand the world, but they are not. This is not an exact science, and we should use theories as tools to understand the conflict, but remember that they are not applicable to all cases. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with this, and thanks for listening.